In the winter of 1794, as revolutionary terror swept across France with the inevitability of an avalanche, a dozen monks made a choice that would cost most of them their lives. They refused to flee, while their brothers packed what few possessions they could carry and vanished into the night toward Switzerland and Italy. These men gathered in the cold stone choir of Sainte-Croix Abbey and made a simple vow. They would remain at their posts, tending the gardens, maintaining the chapel, and keeping the 7 daily offices of prayer, come what may. Within 3 months, the soldiers arrived. Within 6, only 2 of them remained alive. But in those final months, in that remote mountain abbey, they bore witness to something that the revolution, for all its violence and certainty, could never entirely destroy: the power of human commitment to something beyond the self, beyond politics, beyond survival itself. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The story of these monks cannot be fully understood without first understanding what they were leaving behind, or rather, what they were choosing not to abandon. Sainte-Croix stood in the Jura Mountains, that ancient range that marks the border between France and Switzerland, a landscape of deep valleys and precipitous cliffs where mist clings to the peaks like a veil between worlds. The mountains themselves are among the most beautiful in all of France, though they are not dramatic in the way of the Alps. Instead, they possess a kind of subtle grandeur, with forests that seem to go on forever, with waterfalls that plunge from hidden sources, with passes and valleys that have sheltered human communities for thousands of years. In autumn, the leaves turn color in layers, the higher elevations changing first, like a wave of gold and crimson descending down the mountainside. In winter, the snow falls thick and silent, transforming the landscape into something almost otherworldly. The abbey itself had been built in the late 13th century, though it rose on a site that had been sacred long before that. Local legends spoke of an ancient Celtic shrine, then a Roman temple, then a Christian hermitage founded by disciples of some early saint whose name had been lost to history. The abbey that finally emerged represented nearly 800 years of continuous habitation, continuous prayer, continuous service. It was not a grand place by the standards of great French monasteries. No kings had showered it with gold. No famous theologians had lectured within its walls. No bishops had made pilgrimages there to seek counsel from renowned spiritual masters. What it was, instead, was essential woven into the daily fabric of life for the mountain communities that surrounded it. For centuries, the monks of Sainte-Croix had been the teachers, healers, and keepers of knowledge for the scattered villages and farms that clung to the mountainside. During the terrible winters, when isolation was nearly complete, they had served as a center of mutual aid and information. They maintained a library that, while not renowned among scholars, contained works that existed nowhere else within 100 miles. These were not only religious texts, though of course there were plenty of those, but also practical volumes on agriculture, medicine, engineering, and natural philosophy. Monks from the abbey had copied manuscripts for centuries, and over time, the collection had grown into something genuinely useful. A farmer uncertain about crop rotation would consult the agricultural texts. A mother worried about a child's fever would send word to the abbey's infirmary. A craftsman wanting to learn a new technique would arrive at the gates seeking knowledge. The monks brewed medicines from herbs grown in carefully tended gardens that occupied a small terrace on the southern face of the abbey. These were not merely vegetable gardens, though they produced food. They were also medicinal gardens, with plants arranged according to elaborate systems of classification and use. Brother Dennis, the herbalist of the community during the period we are concerned with, had spent 30 years learning the properties of the plants that grew in the Jura. He could make a poultice that would draw infection from a wound. He could brew a tea that would ease the pain of childbirth. He could create a tincture that would reduce fever. His knowledge was not written down in any comprehensive way. It lived in his hands and his memory, transmitted orally to the younger monks who assisted him. The surrounding villages relied on this knowledge. When Denis died, as we shall see, a small piece of crucial medical wisdom died with him, knowledge that would take generations to rediscover. The monks kept precise records of weather and harvests, information that local farmers consulted when deciding when to plant and when to prepare for storms. They had been keeping these records for so long that they could identify patterns invisible to individual observers. A farmer's lifetime of experience might span 50 years. The abbey's records spanned centuries. The monks knew that certain patterns of weather in September predicted harsh winters. They knew which crops would fail in years following late spring frosts. They knew how to preserve food in ways that would carry the communities through the worst months. They fed the hungry who appeared at their gates, and in the mountains there was always hunger. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the lives of these monks, explicitly commanded that monks treat all guests as if they were Christ himself. This was not a metaphorical instruction. Every person who arrived at the gate, whether pilgrim or beggar, local villager or passing stranger, was received with the same care and respect. The abbey's kitchens provided meals. The abbey's hospice offered shelter. The abbey's wells provided water. The abbey's fire offered warmth. They offered shelter to travelers caught in sudden storms. The mountains could turn violent with almost no warning. A clear day could become a whiteout in the space of an hour. Travelers caught on the roads when such storms struck would almost certainly die if they could not find shelter. The abbey served as a refuge for these people. The monks would bring them in, dry their clothes, feed them, let them rest. When the storm passed, the travelers would continue on their way. Sometimes they were able to offer payment. Often they were not. The abbey did not keep accounts of these debts. They rang the bells that marked time itself for the surrounding communities. The abbey's bells were large and ancient, cast centuries ago by craftsmen whose names were long forgotten. They had a particular sound, complex and resonant, that could be heard for many kilometers across the mountain valleys. In communities where few people owned watches or clocks, the sound of the abbey bells marked the passage of the day. The community rose when the bells rang for prime. It paused its work at midday when the bells rang for sext. It knew evening was coming when the bells rang for vespers. The bells were not merely instruments of timekeeping. They were a constant reminder of an order that transcended the chaos of daily life, a order that was ancient and reliable and part of the fabric of existence itself. They transcribed documents for families who needed records kept. In the pre-modern world, literacy was not common, and the preservation of important documents was a concern of genuine weight. If you were a family of some substance, you might need to keep records of land transactions, marriage contracts, inheritance disputes. The abbey's scriptorium offered this service. Monks would carefully copy documents, creating multiple versions that could be stored in different places. This work was not done without payment. The abbey was not wealthy, and such copying required expensive materials, but it was done at rates that most established families could afford. Through this work, the monks became, in effect, a kind of notarial service for the region. They taught reading and writing to the children of any family that could spare them for instruction. The abbey maintained a small school, housed in a separate building attached to the abbey proper. The schoolmaster was a monk named Father Anselm, who had devoted 40 years to this work. He taught the sons of local nobles and wealthy merchants, who would arrive as young boys and stay for several years. He also taught the children of farmers and artisans, who would come for shorter periods when their labor could be spared. The instruction was rigorous. Anselm believed that any child who came to him deserved the best education he could provide. He taught history and theology. He taught calligraphy and composition. For many of the children, this education was transformative. Others would return to their families with skills that would change the trajectory of their lives. Over 4 decades, he had educated perhaps 2,000 children. In exchange for all of these services, the church provided the abbey with certain protections and privileges. The monks paid fewer taxes than ordinary citizens. Their lands could not be easily seized. They answered to ecclesiastical authorities rather than secular ones. This arrangement had persisted for so long that it had become woven to the very fabric of mountain life. It seemed almost natural as the mountains themselves, that this community of men would live apart from ordinary society, engaged in prayer and learning and service, sustained by the tithes and donations of the faithful. The relationship between the abbey and the communities it served was mutually dependent and deeply traditional. It was one of the most stable institutions in a world of constant change and difficulty. There were priests among the revolutionaries themselves, men who believed that reform could be reconciled with faith, that the church might be purified rather than destroyed. These clerics saw the revolution as a means of stripping away the corruption and wealth that had accumulated in the institutional church, returning it to a more authentic spiritual mission. There were monasteries that initially welcomed the end of feudal arrangements and the declaration of universal rights. But by 1792, as the revolution grew more radical and more violent, that brief period of reconciliation had ended. The law required all clergy to take oaths supporting the revolutionary government and renouncing papal authority. It was a test of loyalty that many clergy could not pass. To refuse the oath was to declare oneself an enemy of the revolution. And then came the massacres of 1792. In September of that year, as rumors spread that foreign armies were about to invade, and as the radical elements of the revolution convinced themselves that there were counter-revolutionary conspirators hidden in the prisons, mobs stormed the jails and executed more than 1,000 people, many of them clergy. It was sudden, violent, and shocking. The massacres awakened many to the reality that the revolution had turned dangerous, that the promise of enlightenment and reason had curdled into something darker and more destructive. In the aftermath, anyone associated with the old church faced serious danger. And came the Reign of Terror in 1793 and 1794, when the revolution turned openly atheist and began systematically hunting and executing priests and monks. The Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre's leadership, had decided that the survival of the revolution depended on the complete destruction of the old religious order. Churches were desecrated. Religious objects were destroyed or melted down for their material. Clergy were arrested, tried, and executed. The machinery of death, once started, seemed to have a momentum of its own. The numbers grew and grew. Thousands of clergy were killed. Whole monasteries were emptied. The institutional church, which had seemed so permanent and unchangeable, suddenly appeared to be on the verge of extinction. The decree of 1792 that required all clergy to take oaths supporting the revolutionary government had already decimated the monastic communities. Some monks, unable to reconcile their faith with the demands of the state, had fled. Others had been forcibly expelled from their monasteries. Sainte-Croix had been seized as property of the nation by the local revolutionary authority. The monks were ordered to disperse. They were given a deadline a month, if I remember correctly, to vacate the premises. The abbey's lands were inventoried and appropriated. The precious manuscripts in the library began to be packed up, apparently for transfer to revolutionary institutions, though in reality many were destroyed or lost. The bells were marked for removal. The sacred vessels and vestments were seized. Everything that could be transformed into state property or destroyed as symbols of the old regime was targeted. Some monks cooperated. They took the required oaths and attempted to remain in their communities as constitutional clergy, serving in the reformed parishes that were now under state control. Others who refused the oath were forcibly expelled and disappeared into the underworld of hidden priests and persecuted religious communities that emerged across France. There was a network of secret chapels, hiding places, and sympathetic families that sheltered clergy who refused to abandon their faith. Some of these priests became quite famous in later accounts. Mobile, moving from place to place, saying Mass in hidden rooms, administering sacraments to the faithful who remained loyal to the old church. But most of the monks simply fled. By the winter of 1794, most French abbeys stood either completely empty or occupied by revolutionary commissioners who were stripping them of anything of value. But 12 men remained at Sainte-Croix. Their names have been preserved in a series of letters that survived the revolution, hidden away by a local woman named Marguerite de Saulniers, whose family had deep connections to the abbey. Marguerite was the widow of a local merchant and a woman of considerable courage. She had maintained contact with the monastery even after its official closure, and when the final crisis came, she had preserved the letters and journals that the monks had written. Her family kept these documents hidden for many years, not revealing them until well into the 19th century, when it seemed safe to do so. Through her actions, the voices of the monks survived to speak across the centuries. The leader was Abbé Besson, a man in his 60s who had been at Sainte-Croix for more than 40 years. He was not a reformer or a political figure. By all accounts, he was a quiet, studious man who had spent most of his life absorbed in the abbey's library, copying manuscripts and teaching the younger monks. He had never sought prominence. He was not known for charismatic preaching or dramatic theological positions. He had little appetite for the theological controversies that had consumed other abbots' attention in recent years. But he possessed a quality that, in times of crisis, becomes invaluable. He was a man of convictions so deep that they required no debate. His faith was not a matter of intellectual argument or political positioning. It was simply the ground upon which he stood. With him were 11 others, each with his own history and character. Father Michel, who had been at the abbey for 30 years and served as the master of the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied. Michel was a meticulous man, almost obsessive in his attention to detail. He had trained the monks in the disciplines of copying, the careful positioning of the hand, the precise pressure needed on the quill, the mixing of inks to achieve exactly the right consistency and color. Every manuscript that left the scriptorium bore the mark of his standards. Brother Thomas, who was only 23 and had entered the monastery as a novice just before the revolution began. Thomas had known no other life but monastic life. He had entered Sainte-Croix as a boy of 15 at an age when such a choice would have been made essentially by his family, though he must have possessed some inclination toward religious life, or he would not have persisted through the difficult early years. By the time of the revolution, he had been at the abbey for 8 years. It was the only world he knew. Brother Laurent, who managed the kitchens and gardens. Laurent was a practical man, the kind of person who understood how to make things work in the material world. He knew which seeds to plant, and when, how to coax maximum productivity from the gardens, how to preserve food for the winter months. He was skilled at improvisation. If something broke, he could usually devise a way to fix it or work around it. He had also, at some point in his life before entering the monastery, been a soldier. This fact would take on unexpected significance later. Brother Denis, their healer and master of the medicinal herbs. Denis was a man of scientific inclination, living before science had become secularized. He approached the study of plants with the same rigor that a modern researcher might approach an experimental protocol. He kept detailed notes on which plants worked for which ailments, how to prepare them, what dosages were effective. His knowledge was practical, but also grounded in a kind of theoretical framework that he had developed through decades of careful observation. And 7 others, whose roles were less prominent, but no less vital to the functioning of the monastery. Brother Anselm, the schoolmaster. Brother Paul, who assisted Denis in the infirmary. Brother Robert, who cared for the lodge stock. Brother Matthias, who served as cantor and led the singing in the choir. Brother Jean-Claude, who worked in the library, Brother Augustine, who served as cook under Laurent's direction, and Brother Ignatius, the youngest of the group after Thomas, who served as sacristan and cared for the chapel. They ranged in age from 23 to 71. They represented different temperaments and different depths of faith. Some were scholarly, others practical. Some were communicative and warm, others quiet and reserved. But they shared one thing, one crucial thing. They could not bear to leave. The decision to stay was not dramatic or sudden. It did not come as a moment of revelation or a sudden inspiration. Instead, it emerged gradually over weeks and months in quiet conversations in the warming room during the coldest hours of winter, in moments of doubt and recommitment, in the accumulated weight of small decisions that pointed in the same direction. The monks had been living in a kind of liminal state since the abbey's seizure. They remained physically present in the space, but their right to be there had been revoked. They continued their routines, but under the assumption that these routines might end at any moment. They were living in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for the final blow to fall. According to one account written years later by Brother Thomas in a memoir that was eventually published in the 19th century, Abbé Besson had first raised the question in November 1793 after receiving notice that the abbey was to be formally closed and its remaining inhabitants expelled. He did not command anyone to stay. He was not the type of person to command. Instead, he posed a question to the brothers gathered in the refectory after their evening meal, at a time when the community customarily met to discuss important matters. "If we leave," he asked, "who will keep this place? Who will pray in this chapel? Who will remember what it means?" It was not a rhetorical question, and he did not present it as if the answer was obvious. He seemed genuinely interested in what the brothers might think. He seemed open to the possibility that they might all conclude that flight was the only rational option. Some of the monks argued for flight immediately. Father Michel was one of the initial advocates for moving to Switzerland, where there were already established communities of French exiles living unmolested in the cantons near Geneva. Michel was not arguing from cowardice. He had thought the matter through carefully. He pointed out practical considerations. They had almost no resources. The stores of food would not last through the winter if they weren't replenished, and the revolutionary authorities had already made clear that harboring clergy or allowing them to continue their religious practices would result in execution. He had connections in Switzerland and believed he could arrange for the community to be received there. It was not an ignoble option. It would have allowed the monks to continue their religious life in safety. There were plenty of precedents for this kind of exile. Many worthy religious people had chosen this path, but something held the others back from accepting this solution. It was not bravery, exactly, though there was bravery in it. It was something more subtle, a kind of fidelity that had no rational justification in the world that was being born around them. The monks sat in silence for a long time after Abbé Besson posed his question. Then Brother Laurent spoke. He said something to the effect that he had lived at Sainte-Croix for 35 years, and he did not know how to be anywhere else. This was not said with drama or emotion. It was simply a statement of fact. He could not imagine starting over somewhere else, even if that somewhere else was safe. The mountains of the Jura were his home. This abbey was the only community he had ever known as an adult. Brother Anselm spoke next. He said that he had spent 40 years teaching children in the school attached to the abbey. Those children and their children had gone out into the world carrying knowledge and values that he had tried to impart to them. To abandon the place where this work had been done felt like a betrayal of that work. It felt like saying that the work had no lasting value, that it could be erased as easily as footprints in the snow. Brother Dennis said that he had spent decades learning the properties of plants and their uses in healing. This knowledge was precious and fragile. If he left, it would be scattered and lost. Much of it existed only in his memory and in the memories of the younger monks whom he had trained. To abandon the place and the work felt like allowing that knowledge to die. One by one, the monks spoke, and one by one, they arrived at similar conclusions through different pathways. It was not that they all felt called to martyrdom. It was that they could not find a way to rationalize abandoning what they had devoted their lives to, even when that abandonment would save their lives. Abbé Besson listened to all of this without interrupting. When all the monks had spoken, he rose and blessed them. He did not announce a decision. He simply acknowledged what they had expressed and blessed them for their willingness to be honest about their convictions. In the weeks that followed, the community continued its daily routine as if nothing fundamental had changed. They rose at 3 in the morning for matins, the first office of the day. They gathered in the chapel for the canonical hours. Lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour, terce at the third, sext at midday, none at the 9th hour, vespers in the late afternoon, and compline at night before bed. They worked in the gardens and the library, the kitchen and the infirmary. They maintained the abbey as a functioning community, a space of prayer and learning and service, even as the world outside descended into madness. They understood, with perfect clarity, that this was likely a death sentence. But they also understood, with equal clarity, that they could not do anything else. One of the most revealing documents from this period is a letter from Father Michel to a cousin who had already fled to Switzerland. The letter is dated January 1794, so it was written roughly 2 months after the decision to stay. It reads, "You ask me why we do not leave. You have written 3 times, expressing your worry for us and your conviction that we are throwing our lives away for no good reason. I can understand your concern. From the perspective of someone living in Geneva, surrounded by safety and others who share your faith, our choice must seem incomprehensible. But I want to try to explain it, not with the expectation that you will agree with me, but simply so that you can understand that we have not arrived at this decision through madness or fanaticism. It is not that we do not fear death. We do. We fear it very much. I confess that sometimes in the night, I lie awake with my heart striking against my ribs like fists, contemplating the manner of death that likely awaits us. I am not a brave man by nature. I would prefer safety. I would prefer to grow old among friends, to continue my work of copying manuscripts, to see the seasons turn year after year in this place that has become my home. All of these preferences pull me toward flight. But there is something in being in this place, in these stones, in this work, that feels more necessary than safety. For 800 years, monks have prayed in this chapel. The crops have come in because we understood the seasons and taught others to understand them. Children have learned to read from our books. The sick have been healed by our medicines. All of this was a gift given to this place, and we are the stewards of it. To abandon it feels like a betrayal of something deeper than politics, something that will matter long after the revolution has destroyed itself. The revolution wishes to teach us that nothing is sacred except the state. It wishes to teach us that tradition is merely the weight of dead hands upon the living. It wishes to teach us that loyalty to a place or a practice is an illusion that must be burned away to reveal the truth, that we are all individuals separated from one another, united only by our allegiance to the collective political project. I wish to testify, by whatever means are available to me, that this is not true. There is something sacred in this place. The tradition we inherit is not a weight but a gift. The loyalty we feel to this community, and this practice is not an illusion, but one of the deepest realities of human existence. I cannot prove these things through argument. I can only demonstrate them through my actions. And if I must die to make this demonstration, then perhaps that death will be its own kind of speech, speaking to those who come after me of the reality and power of commitment to something beyond the self. The letter ends there. Michel never sent it. It was found among his papers after his death, and it is unclear whether it's ever intended for posting or whether it was merely a kind of private meditation written in the form of a letter. But it captures something essential about the thinking of these monks. They were not irrational. They had thought through the consequences of their choice. But they had come to a different calculation than the one that would lead to flight. They had decided that fidelity was worth more than survival. By December 1793, the decision had solidified. The 12 monks would stay. They would continue their routine as if nothing had changed, as much as possible. They would rise for matins at 3 in the morning. They would gather in the chapel for the canonical hours. They would work in the gardens and the library, the kitchen and the infirmary. They would maintain the abbey as a functioning community, a space of prayer and learning and service, even as the revolutionary authorities grew closer and more threatening. They understood, with perfect clarity, that this was likely a death sentence. But they also understood, with equal clarity, that they could not do anything else. The winter of 1794 was brutal beyond description. The abbey sits at an elevation of nearly 2,000 feet in a mountainous region where the winters are long and severe. The snow came early that year, arriving in November, and it never truly melted. New snow fell repeatedly throughout December and January and February. The drifts piled up to the roofs of the lower buildings. The access roads became impassable. The abbey was cut off from the world, accessible only by paths through deep snow that would have been dangerous to traverse even for those familiar with the terrain. The communal stores of food that the monks had been able to preserve were limited. The revolution had already seized much of the abbey's productive lands, redirecting the harvest to feed the revolutionary armies. The surrounding villages, themselves suffering from hunger, could offer little assistance. The monks had been able to preserve what they could from the previous autumn's harvest: grain, dried beans, and lentils, root vegetables stored in the cool cellars beneath the abbey, cheese made from the milk of the abbey as diminished herd of cattle before the animals had been partially seized by revolutionary authorities. They had apples dried and stored in baskets lined with straw. They had preserves that the kitchen had made in the late summer. They had stores of honey from the abbey's bees. But everything was rationed carefully, with the assumption that it would need to last through a very long winter. The monks rationed their food carefully, with a precision that would have seemed cruel if it had not been born of necessity. They began each day with a small portion of bread, perhaps 1/4 of a modern loaf, and weak chicory coffee, a drink that provided warmth and a sense of substance without much nutritional value. Their main meal, in the afternoon after the work of the day, consisted of vegetable soup made from the last of the stored root vegetables, supplemented occasionally by dried beans or lentils. They had cheese from the previous autumn, but they ate it sparingly, perhaps once or twice a week, a slice thin enough to see through. They had bread with their meals, though the amount was strictly limited. On feast days, and even in their precarious situation, they maintained the liturgical calendar. They might have something special, dried fruit, or a small piece of meat from the abbey's declining herd of animals, or a slightly larger portion of cheese. But these occasions were rare. Most days were days of severe restriction. There were nights when some of the men went to bed genuinely hungry, when the small ration that had been allocated for the day proved insufficient for bodies engaged in physical labor. Brother Thomas recorded in his journal that he began to experience hunger dreams, vivid nocturnal visions of feasts, of tables laden with food, of the ability to eat without limit. He would wake from these dreams with a desperate hunger that the reality of the day could not satisfy. The cold was almost worse than the hunger. The abbey's heating system, such as it was, relied on large fireplaces in the common rooms and on the labor-intensive task of carrying heated stones to the sleeping cells. The stones would be heated in the kitchen and then carefully carried through the abbey to the small, individual cells where the monks slept, wrapped in cloth to retain their heat. As they cooled through the night, the warmth would gradually dissipate, and by the time the bell rang for matins at 3 in the morning, the stones would be cold and the cells would be back to near freezing temperature. But firewood was precious, and not easily replaced. The abbey had maintained small woodlots in the surrounding forest, but these could not be harvested easily in the deep snow. They burned what they could gather, fallen branches from the forest, scrap wood from repairs, even sections of old shelving from the library that had rotted beyond use and could serve no other purpose. It was never enough. Brother Laurent, the practical manager of resources, made the decision that some of the abbey's buildings should be essentially abandoned during the winter months. The monks would concentrate themselves in a small section of the abbey that included the chapel, the refectory, the kitchen, the library, and the sleeping cells. Other buildings, the dormitory used for visiting pilgrims, the guest house, the schoolhouse, would be left unheated. The doors would be locked to conserve warmth. It was a rational decision that allowed the limited heat to be concentrated where it was most needed. But it was also a kind of retreat, a contraction of the abbey's footprint in response to existential threat. In the depths of winter, the temperature in the sleeping quarters often dropped well below freezing. The monks slept in their habits, the heavy woolen robes that were their daily garb, wrapped in thin woolen blankets that had been mended so many times they were nearly transparent. Many of the blankets had been patched with pieces of other blankets, creating a kind of patchwork where the original weave was barely visible. Brother Thomas later recalled waking in the dark to find ice on his beard from his own frozen breath. He wrote about the shock of it, the reality of his own exhalation freezing in the air around him. He also wrote about the beauty of it, the ice crystals catching what little light filtered through the high windows in the cell, creating patterns of extraordinary delicacy. The brothers would wake at 3 a.m. for matins, rising from their cold beds and making their way through the dark corridors of the abbey toward the chapel. The corridors themselves were barely above freezing temperature. Their feet were often numb by the time they reached the chapel. But in the chapel, they would find one of the large fireplaces lit, providing a modicum of warmth and a kind of sacred center around which their bodies could gather. And as they began to sing the psalms and the prayers of matins, something would happen that transcended the physical discomfort. The cold would recede into the background. The hunger would be forgotten. The uncertainty and fear would be temporarily suspended. There would be only the words, the music, the community gathered in prayer. Yet they kept the offices. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their resistance. They did not reduce their spiritual practice or adapt it to their circumstances. They did not decide that, given the extreme conditions, a simplified version of the liturgical hours would be acceptable. They did not consolidate offices or eliminate some of them. Every day, at the appointed hours, the bells rang out across the empty mountains. The 12 monks gathered in the chapel, and they chanted the psalms and the prayers that had been chanted there for 8 centuries. Their voices, often strained from hunger and cold, nevertheless rose in the ancient Latin words. In a world that had declared all of this meaningless, they insisted on its meaning. In a world that had made the monasteries monuments to a dead past, they refused to allow the past to die. In a world that was reducing human existence to economics and politics and material interest, they maintained a practice that served none of these utilitarian purposes. They sang because they had vowed to sing. They prayed because they had vowed to pray. The rationality of revolution could offer no answer to this kind of fidelity. The chapel of Sainte-Croix was a space of austere beauty. Its walls were constructed of pale stone quarried from the mountains in the centuries-long past, stone that had been shaped by patient hands and fitted together with precision. The vaulted ceilings rose to heights of perhaps 40 feet, creating a sense of vast interior space. The effect was to make the human form seem small and insignificant, to locate individual human beings within a framework that was vastly larger than any single life. There were few windows, and they were high and narrow, allowing only thin shafts of light to penetrate the interior, especially in winter when the sun's angle was so low. The effect, especially in winter when the light was dim and gray, was to create a space that seemed somehow outside of time, or in conversation with a time far longer than human life. The chapel was cold, brutally cold, but it possessed a quality of transcendence. When the monks sang, their voices were absorbed into the stone, transformed by the acoustics into something that seemed to come from the building itself rather than from human throats. The sound was not quite echo, not quite reverberation, but something more complex, a kind of multiplication of sound that made 12 voices seem like a much larger choir. It would be tempting to say that this was a kind of consolation, a spiritual comfort that sustained them through the difficult months. Perhaps it was, but the more honest assessment is that it was simply what they had committed to do. It was their practice, their vow. Whether it brought comfort or not was secondary to the commitment itself. As January turned to February, and February to March, the weight of isolation began to press on the community in new ways. No one came to the Abbey anymore. The pilgrim paths that once brought visitors from the surrounding villages had become impassable. Even if they had not been physically impassable, political conditions would have made it dangerous for ordinary people to be seen seeking religious services at a closed and forbidden monastery. The Abbey had, for 8 centuries, been a place where people came seeking healing, guidance, knowledge, hospitality. That role had vanished. The Abbey had become a refuge not for those in need, but for the monks themselves. The surrounding villages, themselves consumed with the chaos and terror of the Revolution, had no cause to visit. There were rumors in the area that royalist resistance fighters, the Schwans, as they were known, were using the mountains for refuge and organization. If this became widely known, the Abbey might be seen as complicit, as harboring counter-revolutionary forces. But it might also be seen as simply a hiding place for enemies of the Republic. The monks tried to make themselves invisible, but invisibility itself was dangerous in the world of the Revolution. Anything unusual attracted scrutiny. Anything that deviated from the new order invited investigation and punishment. The isolation was not merely physical, though it was certainly that. It was also informational and spiritual. The monks had no reliable way of knowing what was happening in the wider world. Occasionally, someone from a nearby village would make the dangerous journey to the Abbey to bring news information, gleaned from official proclamations, or travelers' reports, or rumors. Through these reports, the monks learned that the terror was continuing and even intensifying. More clergy were being executed. More monasteries were being destroyed. More communities were being torn apart by the demand that people denounce those who harbored priests or participated in clandestine religious observances. The monks learned that they were living in what was meant to be the final destruction of the old church. The revolutionary authorities in Paris had decided that the survival of the revolution itself required the complete elimination of institutional Christianity. The old order, the feudal system that had organized European society for 1,000 years, had been built upon the church as one of its pillars. If the revolution was to succeed, if the new rational order was to take hold, the church had to be destroyed completely. There could be no middle ground, no coexistence. It had to be absolute. By March, the first sign that their presence had been noted came in the form of a local official who appeared at the Abbey gates with a small squad of men. His name was Pierre Dufour, and he had been appointed by the convention as a commissioner responsible for the revolutionary purification of the region. He was a thin man with cold eyes, and the manner of someone who had convinced himself that cruelty was efficiency. He was not pleased to find that the Abbey was still occupied. Dufour came from a town about 30 kilometers away, a town that had embraced the revolution with particular fervor. He had been chosen as commissioner precisely because he showed no hesitation about implementing the most extreme measures. He was not motivated by personal cruelty, at least, not obviously. Rather, he seemed to have internalized the revolutionary logic completely. He believed, genuinely, that the destruction he was carrying out was necessary for human progress. He believed that the old church was an obstacle to human liberation. He believed that the monks who persisted in their religious practices were enemies of the people, and he approached the execution of his duties with the kind of thoroughness that comes from absolute conviction. According to an account written by one of the monks who survived, Dufour's initial instinct was to arrest all of them immediately. He saw them as enemies of the state, living evidence of resistance to revolutionary authority. His first impulse was to eliminate the problem directly and completely, but he realized that doing so would require him to provide transport to the nearest major city where they could be tried and executed according to proper procedure. This would involve considerable effort and expense, requiring soldiers and resources, writing reports, and obtaining authorization. And the commissioners in Paris were always complaining about the cost of administering the terror, about the expenses involved in the machinery of justice and punishment. Money that went into executing people in remote mountain abbeys was money not available for other purposes. Instead, Dufour contented himself with informing Abbé Besson that the abbey had been seized as property of the nation, that all religious observances were prohibited, and that the monks were to cease their activities immediately. He gave them 1 week to vacate the premises. This was not a request. It was an order backed by the force of the state and the threat of violence. If they did not leave within 7 days, they would be arrested. The monks did not vacate. Dufour, more annoyed than surprised, returned to his regular duties. He filed a report. He did not immediately follow up with arrests. This was not because he was merciful, but because the machinery of the terror, for all its ferocity, was also bureaucratic and somewhat cumbersome. Killing a dozen monks in a remote abbey required paperwork and coordination. It was easier to move on to other matters. Dufour had other duties, other threats to address, other purifications to oversee. He could not personally oversee the arrest and execution of every refractory priest or resistant monk. That would consume all of his time. Better to move on and let the machinery of the state handle it eventually. This reprieve lasted approximately 2 months. During this time, the monks continued their routine with an awareness that their time was limited. They knew that eventually someone would decide to eliminate this last pocket of resistance. The question was when, and whether they would have any warning. They tried to prepare themselves spiritually for what was coming. They wrote letters to families and friends. They made careful notes about the work they had been doing, so that if anyone survived, they could continue it. They deepened their spiritual practice, spending more time in prayer, meditating on the meaning of martyrdom and sacrifice. Brother Thomas, the youngest of them, kept a record of this period. His entries were brief and careful, the product of years of monastic training in the discipline of written language. He wrote about the work of the day, the repair of a leak in the roof, the germination of seeds begun indoors to prepare for spring planting, the copying of a particularly difficult manuscript in the scriptorium. He wrote about the weather, cold wind from the north, snow fell for 6 hours then stopped, first day without frost on the morning stones. He wrote about the community. Father Michel spoke during dinner about the martyrs of the early church. His voice was very quiet. Several of the brothers were weeping. He wrote about the liturgy and the seasons of the church calendar. He wrote about small moments of beauty and grace. This morning, as I carried water from the well, a bird landed on the rim of my bucket. I do not know what kind of bird. It was gray and small. It looked at me with great attention for perhaps 30 seconds, then flew away. In that moment, I felt that God was present in the world, even now, even here. But he did not write much about fear or doubt. That restraint itself was a kind of testimony to the quality of discipline that held the community together even as the ground shifted beneath them. The monks had learned, through years of monastic training, to master their emotions, to channel their inner experience into the container of the liturgical life. This discipline did not mean that they did not experience fear or doubt. Rather, it meant that they had learned to live alongside these experiences without being overwhelmed by them. Yet there are occasional breaks in this restraint in Brother Thomas's journal. In one entry, dated mid-April, Thomas wrote, "I dreamed last night that we were all birds, unable to fly, and the chapel was a cage that was growing smaller. I woke with my heart striking against my ribs like fists. Brother Laurent was also awake. I could hear him breathing. Neither of us spoke. We lay in the cold and waited for Matins' bell." This entry captures something of the psychological weight that was building in the community. They were waiting. They knew that what they were waiting for would likely kill them, but they waited nonetheless. By late April, the community knew that the end was coming. There was no dramatic announcement, no specific threat. Rather, it was a general awareness that spread among them like an illness. The word from sympathetic people in the villages, and there were still some people who maintained secret loyalties to the old church. And sympathy for the monks was that Dufour had been requesting orders from Paris regarding the disposal of the remaining clergy in the High Abbey. The requests had gone unanswered for months, but now, in the deepest phase of the terror, when hundreds were being executed daily, the convention had finally attended to it. An order was being prepared. It was only a matter of time before soldiers arrived to enforce it. It was in this context that Abbé Besson made a final decision that would come to define the community's end. He called the monks together and asked if any of them wished to leave. He presented this not as a suggestion, but as an order from their spiritual father. "I release you from your vows," he told them. "If you wish to go, you may go, and I will give you whatever we can spare for the journey. No one will think less of you. God will understand. Your lives have value beyond this place. If you wish to preserve them, I will not stand in your way." This offer was genuine. Abbé Besson was not seeking a display of loyalty or sacrifice. He was offering his community members a possibility of life. It would have been entirely understandable if some or all of them had taken it. They had already endured months of extreme hardship and psychological strain. They knew that arrest and execution lay ahead. They were still relatively young men. The youngest was only 23, the oldest 71. They had lives that could be lived. They had skills that could be put to use elsewhere. They could flee to Switzerland or Italy or America. They could rebuild their lives in safety. The offer was also, in a sense, selfless. By releasing them from their vows and encouraging them to go, Abbé Besson was giving them permission to survive. In the logic of the monastery, the vow was binding. Once made, it could not be undone except through formal ecclesiastical process. But Besson was granting this release informally, spiritually, recognizing that the normal categories had been suspended by the chaos of the revolution. He was saying, essentially, "I absolve you. You are free to go. Your departure will not be a failure or a betrayal in my eyes." None of them left. This seems, on the surface, incomprehensible to modern sensibility. Why would a 23-year-old choose death? Why would a 65-year-old priest refuse the possibility of spending his remaining years in safety in Switzerland or Italy? Why would any of them stay in a place where arrest and execution were not merely possible but inevitable? The historical record does not provide explicit answers to these questions. Instead, it offers us fragments, a letter here, a remembered conversation there, the entries in Brother Thomas's journal, from which we must construct our own understanding. One possibility is simple inertia. They had stayed so long that leaving had become impossible, not in any practical sense, but in a spiritual or psychological one. The routine of the abbey, the bells ringing at appointed hours, the gathering in the chapel, the work in the library and gardens had become the structure holding their lives together. To leave would be to step outside of that structure into chaos and uncertainty. For men whose entire understanding of existence was predicated on order and routine, this may have felt like the true death, not the cessation of the body, but the dissolution of the self. They were monks. To be a monk meant to be in a monastery, to participate in the round of offices, to work in the communities of the abbey. To leave might preserve their physical bodies, but would destroy their identities as monks. Another possibility is theological. In early Christian theology, there was a concept known as witness through blood, the idea that dying for the faith was itself a form of testimony, a demonstration of commitment that transcended all rational calculation. There was a long tradition, extending back to the martyrs of the Roman persecutions, of Christians accepting death as a means of bearing witness to the truth of their faith. The idea was that the willingness to die proved something essential, that one believed in something beyond the self, beyond material existence, beyond the demands of the state. This kind of testimony had a power that words alone could never have. The monks at Sainte-Croix would certainly have been familiar with this tradition. They studied the lives of the saints. They read accounts of the martyrs of the early church. They knew that in the early centuries of Christianity, many had accepted death rather than compromise their faith. In their own time, as the church was being attacked once again, they may have understood their own potential deaths not as failures, but as the culmination of monastic life, the ultimate sacrifice that all their vows had been preparing them for. To refuse this opportunity might have felt like a betrayal of the tradition they inherited. A third possibility is simpler and perhaps more honest. They were afraid. Not of death, necessarily, but of the specific forms of death that lay ahead if they tried to flee. To flee to Switzerland would require traveling through dangerous terrain in the spring mud, possibly pursued by soldiers. To be captured while fleeing would be worse than to be captured at home, because it would constitute clear evidence of resistance rather than passive presence. The blade of the guillotine was quick, at least. Death in pursuit, pursued like a hunted animal, would be different. Perhaps it seemed safer, or at least more controllable, to remain in the abbey and accept whatever came. Perhaps the truth contained elements of all of these. But perhaps there was something else as well, something that has been largely lost to modern sensibility, because we have become uncomfortable with the concept. Perhaps they stayed because they loved the place. They loved the stones of the chapel, worn smooth by centuries of the shuffle of feet and the fall of knees in prayer. They loved the library with its carefully organized shelves and its irreplaceable manuscripts. They loved the gardens and the seasons that turned in them. They loved the routine of the bells and the offices and the work of their hands. They loved the community itself and the bonds that had been woven between them over years and decades. And they understood that this love, this commitment to something beyond themselves, this refusal to treat their own survival as the highest good, was the only thing that made their life meaningful. To abandon it would have been to render meaningless everything they had done, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had devoted themselves to. A man who will not die for something. Abbé Besson wrote in a letter to his successor, a letter that he may or may not have expected to be read, is already dead inside. The revolution wishes to teach us that life is the highest good and survival is the supreme value. I wish to testify, by whatever means are available to me, that this is a lie. There are things worth dying for. This place is one of them. This community is one of them. This faith is one of them. If I must die to say this, then dying becomes its own form of speech. My death will be an argument against the revolution's claim that nothing matters except the continuation of physical existence. The order from Paris arrived. In the first week of May, Dufour came to the abbey with a larger contingent of soldiers, perhaps 15 or 20 men. Accounts vary slightly. Some sources say they came on horseback, others that they came on foot. What is clear is that they came with sufficient force to ensure that there would be no resistance, no attempt to flee. The soldiers surrounded the abbey to prevent any escape. They were armed with muskets and sabers. They had been given clear orders: arrest the monks and transport them to the nearest major city for trial and execution. The monks were arrested in the chapel during Vespers, the evening office. This detail has been confirmed by multiple sources and seems to have been intentional, a deliberate desecration of the sacred space, an interruption of the prayers that had been the rhythm of the community for so long. According to the account of a local woman who witnessed the arrest from a distance, she had hidden in the forest to observe what was happening. As the soldiers entered, and the monks were told to cease praying and stand with their hands bound, Brother Thomas continued singing. He completed the verse he had begun. It was only when he finished, and silence fell over the chapel, that he allowed himself to be bound. The soldiers who witnessed this were apparently unmoved by it. They were simply following orders. They did not see his continued singing as a demonstration of faith or commitment. They saw it as insubordination, and it might have resulted in him being beaten or killed on the spot, except that the officer in charge apparently decided that it was more efficient to transport them all to the city, for the official machinery of justice to handle. The monks were taken to a prison in a larger town, perhaps 20 kilometers away, a journey that took several days. The soldiers and their captives had to travel slowly, especially since the roads were still somewhat muddy from the spring thaw. The monks were not treated with particular cruelty during the journey. They were fed and given shelter for the night, though in harsh conditions. They were simply prisoners being transported to face the machinery of revolutionary justice. They were held in the prison for several days while paperwork was prepared and legal formalities were observed. The revolutionary authorities were, despite their reputation for bloodthirsty spontaneity, actually quite concerned with procedure. Even the executions had to be properly documented. Trials had to be conducted, even if the outcome was predetermined. Evidence had to be recorded. Judgments had to be pronounced. The monks were questioned about their political allegiances, about whether they had been in contact with royalist forces, about their beliefs regarding the revolution and the Constitution. They maintained steadfast silence, neither confessing nor defending themselves. When asked directly, "Do you accept the authority of the Republic?" they would not answer affirmatively or negatively. This refusal itself was a kind of testimony. It said, "I will not dignify this question with an answer. I will not recognize the authority of this court. I will not participate in this machinery of injustice by defending myself within its framework." The trial was perfunctory. The revolutionary court heard the accusations that the monks were refractory clergy who had refused to take oaths supporting the revolution, that they had continued to conduct religious observances after such observances had been prohibited, that they had resisted the orders of the revolutionary commissioner to vacate their property. All of this was true, and the monks did not deny it. A court found them guilty and sentenced them all to death. The sentence was to be carried out by guillotine, the revolutionary method of execution. The date was set for May 17, 1794, early in the morning, as was customary. On May 17, 1794, 12 monks were transported to the main square of the nearest major city. A guillotine had been erected. A crowd was present. Executions were still, at this time, considered public spectacles, though by May of 1794, the novelty had worn off considerably. The early months of the Terror had drawn large crowds, people fascinated and horrified by the machinery of death. By the spring of 1794, executions had become routine. Most of the crowd was obliged to be there rather than choosing to attend. They stood in the rain, gray and wet, watching this final chapter of what had been the last pocket of monastic resistance. What happened next has been preserved in a brief account written by a priest who was imprisoned in the same facility and who witnessed the executions from a small window in a neighboring building. He wrote that, as each monk walked to the guillotine, he or she sang. He wrote he or she, but all 12 monks were men. There were no women in this group. But the priest who witnessed it wrote that it seemed almost unbelievable that these were bodies of men walking to their deaths. It seemed, rather, as if something transcendent was occurring, something that exceeded the categories of ordinary human experience. They sang the Dies Irae, the ancient hymn for the dead, the same words that would have been sung over their bodies in the chapel where they had spent their lives in prayer. The Latin words rose up in the square, in the rain, incongruous and powerful. Some accounts say that bystanders wept. Others say that revolutionary officials became angry, seeing the singing as a kind of mocking defiance. But the monks continued. "I heard their voices," the priest who witnessed wrote, "and for a moment I forgot where I was. For a moment I was back in a chapel somewhere, and the singing was not the death song of the condemned, but the ordinary, eternal prayer of the faithful. It was in that moment I understood. They had already won. The revolution could kill their bodies, but it could not kill what they had demonstrated through their lives and their deaths, that there are things more real, more enduring, than the violence of the moment. They had made a choice to belong to something eternal, and in choosing that, they had transcended the power of any temporal authority to truly touch them. 12 monks died on May 17, 1794. The blade fell. The heads dropped into baskets. The bodies were removed. Life in the square returned to its normal rhythms. The soldiers dispersed. The crowd dispersed. The guillotine remained, waiting for the next batch of condemned. But 2 monks did not die that day. Brother Laurent was not executed on May 17th. Neither was Brother Denis. The reasons for their exemption from execution are not entirely clear from the historical record. One account suggests that they were able to convince the authorities that they had taken oaths supporting the revolution and were therefore constitutional priests rather than counter-revolutionary clergy. This explanation seems plausible. Laurent and Denis, perhaps as a practical gesture or as a means of ensuring their survival, might have agreed to take the required oaths when they were first arrested. If they had done so, they would technically not be refractory clergy. They would be constitutional clergy, part of the official, state-approved church structure. Their execution would be legally questionable. Another account suggests that their execution was simply postponed, that they were held in prison expecting to be tried and executed at a later date. But the later date never came. Within weeks, the machinery of the terror began to slow. Robespierre himself was executed on July 28, 1794, just over 2 months after the monks at Sainte-Croix were killed, and with his death, the Committee of Public Safety began to lose power. The terror, which had seemed unstoppable, began to wind down. Executions ceased. Political prisoners began to be released. The whole apparatus of violence and fear began to collapse. What is clear is that Laurent and Denis survived that particular killing and were eventually released from prison as political pressure shifted and the terror began to wind down. Brother Laurent spent the rest of his life moving quietly from place to place, never establishing a permanent home. He lived another 30 years, long enough to witness the Concordat of 1801, in which Napoleon negotiated a renewed relationship between France and the Catholic Church that allowed religious practice to resume in a modified form. He was eventually able to return to monasteries and to resume religious life openly. But he never returned to Sainte-Croix Abbey, though he visited it once, years later, and was reported to have spent an entire day in the chapel in silence. Visitors who encountered him there said that he did not eat or move. He simply sat and was present to the space. He died in 1824 at an age of approximately 80 in a small Benedictine community in the south of France. His journals, which survived him, are sparse. There is little in them that explicitly addresses the experience of being the sole survivor of a community that was largely annihilated. But there is a quality of quietness in the later entries, a sense of a man who had learned to live with a weight that could not be fully described. One of his last entries, written just months before his death, reads simply, "I do not know why I lived when the others died. I cannot find in myself any quality that would justify my survival. I can only assume that God had a purpose I have not yet understood. I can only try to live in such a way that my survival means something. Brother Denis also survived and lived into old age. He eventually became a physician and continued his work of healing, both in clandestine religious communities and in secular medical practice. Unlike Brother Laurent, Denis spoke occasionally about his experiences. He was once quoted as saying, "I have always wondered why I lived when the others did not. I cannot give myself any reason that feels adequate. I can only say that survival without purpose is a kind of death as well, and I have tried to ensure that my survival had some purpose beyond mere continuation of breathing. I have tried to live in such a way that the death of my brothers was not utterly meaningless. Each person I have healed, each life I have been able to save through the knowledge of Sainte-Croix, is in some sense a memorial to those who died." Denis lived until 1837, dying at an age of approximately 97. He had lived long enough to see the monarchy restored, then overthrown again, then restored again. He had seen the Church recover much of its institutional power and presence. He had lived a long and productive life healing the sick, teaching younger monks and physicians who came to study with him, preserving and expanding the knowledge of herbal medicine that he had learned from his teachers at the Abbey. The Abbey of Sainte-Croix was eventually recovered by the Church in the early 19th century, after the worst of the revolutionary period had passed and some measure of stability had returned to France. But it was never fully restored to its former function. The library was never completely recovered. Some of the manuscripts had been destroyed or scattered during the Revolution, and the collective knowledge that had been preserved there for centuries was damaged in ways that could not be repaired. A few of the most valuable manuscripts were discovered in the collections of collectors and institutions in Paris and other cities, and these were eventually returned to the Abbey or housed in other religious institutions, but many were lost forever. The gardens were never replanted with their original complexity and order. The knowledge that had been preserved in Brother Laurent's memory and practice died with him. The knowledge that Denis carried in his hands and his memory was only partially preserved in the younger monks who survived to study with him. The bell that had rung out over the mountains for so long was broken down for its metal and never replaced. A new bell was eventually cast, but it did not have the same sound, the same resonance, the same authority that the old bell had possessed. Today, the ruins of Sainte-Croix stand in a remote valley in the Jura, mostly empty, mostly quiet. The chapel's roof has partially caved in, and weather has eroded the walls. Weeds grow in what were once carefully maintained gardens. The stones, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, tell their story in a language that is increasingly difficult to read. Very few people visit. The pilgrimage roads that once brought visitors to this place have been replaced by highways that bypass the mountains entirely. The world has moved on to other concerns, other dramas. The revolution that destroyed the old order has itself become history, studied in textbooks, dramatized in films, reduced to a set of historical facts and interpretive arguments. The monks who died there have been forgotten by most, and yet something remains. On certain days, when the light falls in a particular way, or when the wind moves through the broken roof of the chapel in just the right manner, creating a sound like wind through a vast instrument, it is still possible to imagine the bells ringing and the voices rising in prayer. Visitors who have sat in the ruins for a long time report feeling something that they struggle to name, not quite peace, not quite sadness, but a kind of presence. Whether this is the genuine persistence of something that happened there long ago, or merely the power of history and memory acting on the imagination, is perhaps impossible to determine, but the feeling persists. People leave the ruins changed in some way that they cannot quite articulate. The story of the monks who stayed at Sainte-Croix is not a triumphant story. They did not prevail. The revolution came, as revolutions do, and swept them away. The Abbey did not survive as they had hoped it would. The knowledge they had preserved was lost. The community they had built was destroyed. The work they had done in teaching children and healing the sick and preserving manuscripts was interrupted and dispersed. By any rational measure of success or failure, their choice to remain can be seen as a failure. They tried to preserve something, and they were unable to do so. They died, and within a generation, their work had been forgotten. If the goal was to preserve the monastery as an institution and the traditions it embodied, they failed completely. And yet, in another sense, they won something important. They testified, through their lives and deaths, that there are realities that transcend politics and violence. They demonstrated that human beings are capable of commitments so deep that they cannot be broken by the threat of death. They showed that fidelity to a place, to a community, to a set of values, can be more real and more sustaining than safety or survival. They refused to treat their own lives as the measure of all value. And in doing so, they said something that the revolution, for all its power and violence, could never entirely erase. The revolution taught that everything was political, that all values could be reduced to material interests and class struggle, that traditional loyalties and spiritual commitments were obstacles to the creation of a rational society based on science and progress. The monks at Sainte-Croix, in their final choice to remain, dissented from this teaching. They said, "No, there is something beyond politics. There is something that calls us beyond our own survival. There is a form of life, a practice, a place, a community, a spiritual reality that is worth dying for. It may not be provable by the methods of reason. It may not be reducible to political categories. But it is real nonetheless, perhaps more real than the political machinations that would destroy it." This message did not save the French Revolution from its own violence. History did not vindicate them. The new social order that was built on the Revolution's principles persisted and developed. The secular rationalist worldview that the Revolution championed became dominant. Religious belief became increasingly privatized and marginalized. The institutional church lost much of its power and influence. They were not proven right in any historical sense. They were forgotten by most for many generations. But in the archives and journals and letters that survive them, they left a testimony. They left the record of Brother Thomas singing as he was led to the guillotine. They left Abbé Besson's letters reflecting on the meaning of their choice. They left the physical remains of their place, slowly returning to nature but never entirely erased. They left the story itself, which is a kind of immortality, a way of continuing to speak to those who come later. Centuries after their death, we can still read their words, still imagine the bells ringing, still contemplate the meaning of their choice. The silence that eventually fell over Sainte-Croix Abbey was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of completion, of a vow fulfilled. For more than 800 years, monks had prayed in that place and served the communities around them. These final 12 monks ensured that this work continued to the very end, unbroken and uncompromised. They maintained the offices even as the snow fell and the cold deepened and the world around them descended into violence. When at last they were taken away, the practice itself became history, and history, that paradoxical realm where the dead continue to speak, became their final home. The world has largely forgotten them. There are no statues erected in their honor, no major churches named after them, no annual pilgrimages to commemorate their sacrifice. The revolution ultimately succeeded in destroying the old order that they represented. Modern France, secular, rationalist, democratic, is built on values that are, in many ways, opposed to what these monks embodied. The institutions they belonged to have been marginalized. The certainties they lived by have been questioned and destabilized. The way of life they chose has been rendered almost incomprehensible to modern consciousness. And yet the fact that we can still tell their story, that their choice still seems to speak across the centuries, suggests that they touched something deeper than politics or history. They touched something in the human heart that refuses to be defeated by violence or time. In the final analysis, the monks of Sainte-Croix stayed because they could not do otherwise. They stayed because in a moment when the whole world seemed to be dissolving into chaos and violence and the reduction of all meaning to material interest, the only thing that made sense was to hold on to what was beautiful and true and eternal. They stayed in the face of inevitable death because they had learned something that we in our modern world of constant mobility and shallow commitment and the elevation of survival as the supreme good have largely forgotten, that a life devoted to something beyond ourselves, to something we do not own and cannot control, is the only life worth living. That fidelity, even unto death, even when it accomplishes nothing in worldly terms, is the truest form of human freedom. That there are realities more important than politics, more enduring than the state, more valuable than the individual life. The bells of Sainte-Croix rang for the last time on that winter as day in 1794 when the soldiers came to arrest the monks. The chapel fell silent. The offices ceased. The prayers that had been continuous for 8 centuries were broken. But silence itself became a kind of speech. The empty abbey testified to what had been lost. The ruins that remain today testify to what was attempted. And the story that has survived testifies to what was achieved. Not victory in any conventional sense, but something perhaps more important. The demonstration that human beings are capable of choosing something beyond themselves, of maintaining fidelity in the face of meaninglessness, of bearing witness to realities that cannot be destroyed by any merely temporal power. The silence of the abbey, in the end, was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of completion, the silence of a vow fulfilled, the silence that falls when all that can be said has been said, and all that can be done has been done, and a community gathers to face the end with courage and peace.